I still remember the cold bite of that evening air, the way it slid through the pines and wrapped around my neck like a wet hand. It was late October of 2017, and I had driven out to a small cabin deep in northern Montana, far from the road, far from noise, and far from anything that could distract me from the break I desperately needed. I was 27 back then, tired from long weeks at work, and my friend Mason had let me use his old hunting cabin. He told me it was simple, clean enough, and safe. He didn't mention anything else, and I didn't expect anything else. I just wanted silence. I reached the cabin just before dusk. It was a squat wooden structure with a tin roof, sitting on a small patch of cleared land surrounded by dense trees. The forest around it looked heavy, thick trunks, dark branches, piles of wet leaves pressed flat into the dirt. The place looked like it barely saw sunlight. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, it smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old tools. The floor creaked with every step I took. A small kitchen area sat on the left, a single bed pushed against the back wall, and a wood stove near the center. I unpacked slow, letting the stillness settle into me. It felt peaceful in a lonely kind of way, the kind of peace you only get when you're miles from other people. The last bit of daylight faded behind the trees, and the cabin interior turned dim. I lit a few candles, even though there was a small battery lantern. The candles felt warmer, somehow more comforting in a place like that. I ate a simple dinner, canned soup and crackers, and sat by the wood stove. I could hear the fire pop and crack, mixing with the faint whisper of wind outside. For a long time, nothing happened. I remember thinking how strange it felt to have nothing pulling for my attention. No phone signal, no cars in the distance, no neighbors, just me and the woods. I didn't see the woman until my second night. That day, I had gone for a long walk along a narrow path that wound deeper into the forest. The ground was soft, covered with layers of pine needles that made my steps sound quiet. The air smelled like earth and sap. Everything felt normal, just cold, empty wilderness. I came back tired, a little sweaty under my jacket. By sunset, I was ready to rest. I had been sitting on the small porch, listening to the forest settle for the night. The sky was turning a deep blue, the kind that makes every shape in the woods look sharper and darker. The trees seemed to press closer around the clearing. The temperature dropped fast, and a thin fog had begun to form between the trunks. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just another tree shape, a dark vertical shape among others. But then I noticed the slight shift, like weight moving from one foot to the other. She stood maybe 40 yards away, near the tree line, half hidden behind a thick pine trunk. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I knew it was a woman by the outline of her frame and the long hair hanging down over her shoulders. She wore something pale, maybe a light coat or dress, but it was dirty, smeared with dark streaks that the fading light made look almost black. She was still, too still. She didn't sway with the wind. She didn't shift like someone trying to get a better view. She just stood there, facing my direction. At first, I thought maybe she was a lost hiker, or maybe someone from one of the distant cabins, but the more I looked, the more wrong it felt. There was something unnatural about the way she held herself, rigid, stiff, almost like she was bracing against something. I felt a cold tension creep up my back, the kind that tightens your throat. My brain tried to make sense of it. I tried to convince myself I was just tired, that she was just a person who had wandered too far. But something about her posture told me she wasn't wandering. She was watching. I slowly backed inside the cabin. My hands felt numb, and my breath sounded too loud in the silent room. I closed the door quietly and stood there in the dim candlelight, trying to steady myself. I knew I couldn't leave the door unlocked, so I slid the deadbolt into place. The metal clicked louder than I expected. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lantern on and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to every little sound outside. The faint crack of branches, the rustle of leaves, the wind brushing against the walls. Each noise felt like it carried weight. I told myself she had probably left. She had no reason to stay. But each passing hour made the silence feel heavier, like she was still out there. By morning, the forest looked normal again. Bright, cold sunlight filtered through the trees, making the clearing look harmless. But I still walked out slowly, scanning the tree line. There were footprints, small, narrow footprints, pressed into the soft dirt near the edge of the clearing. They led from the trees toward the cabin, then back into the woods. They weren't mine. For a long minute, I just stared at them. The ground was still moist from the cold air, so the prints looked fresh, maybe from the night before. My skin pricked with unease. I forced myself to breathe and think straight. The woods had people sometimes, hunters, hikers. Maybe someone had gotten lost. Maybe she was confused or scared. Maybe she needed help. But the memory of how she stood there, silent, rigid, didn't match that idea. I didn't go for a walk that day. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping firewood, trying to keep my mind busy. But the feeling of being watched clung to me. Every time I stepped a few feet from the structure, I caught myself looking back at the trees, half expecting to see her again. As evening came, the uneasiness grew. The sun slid behind the treetops, and the clearing fell back into that dim, cold light. I sat inside the cabin with the door locked, trying to distract myself by writing in the small notebook I had brought. But every few minutes, I found myself looking toward the window. It was fully dark when I heard the first sound. A soft, deliberate crunch of leaves outside the window. Not close enough to be right beside the cabin, but close enough that it was someone moving slowly. I froze. My hand tightened on the pen. I didn't dare blow out the lantern. Every muscle in my body felt stiff. I strained my ears and heard another crunch. Then another. Someone was circling the clearing. I didn't move for nearly half an hour. The footsteps were slow, steady, never running, never rushing. Just slow movement through the leaves. Finally, they faded, swallowed by the woods. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time they came closer, some only a few yards from the porch. I made my decision right then. I was leaving. I packed fast, barely eating anything, and loaded my bag into my truck. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see her again. But the forest stayed silent. Still, the feeling didn't lift, not even after I climbed into the truck and turned the key in the ignition. The drive back down the long dirt road took nearly 40 minutes. The forest pressed against the road on both sides, and every shadow felt like it could move. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. When I finally reached the gravel road that led toward the highway, I felt my shoulders drop a little, like I had been carrying something heavy without realizing it. I didn't see her again. I didn't stop the truck once. I didn't look back in the mirrors. I got home late in the afternoon, and even then, the fear hung on me for days. Later, when I talked with Mason, he told me the area had seen random trespassers before. People wandering from old logging roads, campers passing through, even someone living illegally in the forest for a while. He said it wasn't unheard of to find footprints near a cabin. But even now, years later, when I think about the way she stood there, rigid, silent, facing me without moving, I know she wasn't just a lost hiker or a random drifter. There was something in the way she watched me, something heavy and intentional, like she was waiting for something I couldn't understand. I never went back to that cabin. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the wind hits the side of my apartment just right, I think about those slow footsteps circling the clearing. I picture her standing there again, long hair hanging still, pale clothes stained with something dark, her face hidden in the shadows. And I'm glad, truly glad, that I locked the door. I was 32 the year I decided to stay in that old cabin near the graveyard, far outside a small town called Ridgeton. It was early November, the kind of cold where the air feels thin and dry, and the sky looks like a giant gray sheet stretched tight over the land. I had taken a week off work because my head felt crowded and heavy, and I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody knew me. I found the cabin through a last-minute listing. It wasn't really meant for people to stay long, but it was cheap, and the photos showed a simple wooden place with a metal roof. What the listing didn't show, or maybe hid on purpose, was the graveyard sitting less than 100 yards away behind crooked trees and a line of rusted wire fence. I reached the cabin just before sunset. The road leading there was narrow and uneven, with deep tire ruts hardened by old rain and dirt that clung to the underside of my car. When I stepped out, I could smell cold soil and wet leaves. The cabin looked worse than the pictures. Dark wood stained by years of storms, windows scratched by branches, a small porch sagging slightly in the middle like a tired old man. The land around it was flat except for a small rise where the graveyard sat. I could see the shapes of headstones even from the porch, all bent and leaning like they were pushing out of the ground at odd angles. I unloaded my things, taking everything inside in one trip because I didn't like the way the air felt. It wasn't spooky. It was more like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and know someone else was just there. The cabin had one room for sleeping, one for cooking and sitting, and a bathroom that looked like it had been built out of leftover pieces. The smell inside was old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like tools left in the rain. I set up my things, checked the locks, and turned on the small heater. It rattled but worked, filling the place with a soft hum. Outside, the sky turned darker than I expected that fast, and I could barely see the line of the graveyard anymore. Only the fence caught the light sometimes when the wind moved the branches. That first night I tried to read, but every small sound pulled my attention. The heater's hum, the wind tapping branches against the roof, and the creaking of the wooden walls expanding and shrinking in the cold. I kept telling myself it was normal, just an old building reacting to the temperature. Still, I didn't sleep well. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, half listening to something outside that sounded like slow footsteps through dead leaves. I kept trying to explain it. Maybe deer, maybe a stray dog, maybe the wind, but it didn't sound like any of those. It sounded heavier, slower, like someone dragging their feet. The next morning, I walked to the graveyard. I wanted to see it properly, so I wouldn't let my imagination twist it into anything strange. The place was old. The headstones were cracked, some unreadable, some covered in moss. The grass was thin and patchy, with dry weeds poking through the dirt. A few graves had sunken slightly, like the soil had settled unevenly over the years. I noticed that the whole graveyard leaned downhill just a little, as if everything there was sliding toward the cabin over time. I didn't stay long. The cold made my fingers stiff, and the air felt heavier the closer I stood to the oldest graves. When I got back to the cabin, I saw fresh footprints by the porch that weren't mine. They were long, narrow prints that went right across the dirt and disappeared into the trees. At first, I tried to convince myself I had made them before I left, maybe walking around without thinking. But the shape didn't match my boots, and the spacing was too long. I stood there for a while, listening again, but everything was silent. The second night was worse. I fell asleep for maybe an hour, and some noise pulled me awake. It was the sound of something hitting the porch railing. Not a quick tap, but a slow scrape followed by a dull thud, like someone dragging a heavy object across the wood. I stayed in my bed, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I kept waiting for the sound to repeat. When it didn't, the silence felt even heavier, like waiting for something to answer. I forced myself to get up the next morning, even though every part of me wanted to leave. The cabin didn't feel like a place to relax anymore. It felt like a place watching me. I checked the porch, and the railing had a fresh scrape across it, cutting through the old paint. Under the edge of the steps, the dirt was disturbed like someone had crouched there. That afternoon, I tried to go for a long walk just to clear my mind. I went through trees down toward a shallow stream. The land was quiet, no birds, no animals. The only sound was the wind. I kept seeing small broken branches at eye level and long drag marks on the ground, as if something tall had moved through that area recently. The marks went in the direction of the cabin. I followed them back, but they ended before reaching the porch, stopping behind a thick tree trunk where the bark was scratched off at shoulder height. By the time the sun went down, I was sitting in the cabin with my back against the wall, watching the single window that faced the graveyard. The glass had a thin layer of dust on it, but I could see the trees and the faint shape of the fence. The wind picked up again, pushing dead leaves across the ground. For a while, I thought maybe everything was just a trick of cold weather and loneliness. But then something moved near the graveyard fence. It wasn't fast. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow shape shifting between the trees, tall and uneven, like someone walking with one shoulder higher than the other. I couldn't see details, just the outline in the weak moonlight. The shape moved along the fence, then stopped. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. I didn't dare move, not even to breathe deeper. I waited, staring at the window until my eyes hurt. The shape didn't move for a long time. It just stood there, facing the cabin, like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. When I finally looked away for a second to grab my bag, I looked back and it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed alert until dawn, counting every small noise. When the sun finally rose, I made my decision. I packed everything fast, shoving things into my bag without folding them. I stepped outside and looked toward the graveyard one last time. The ground around the fence had deep prints in the dirt, much deeper than anything I could have made. The trees near the fence had long scratches, almost like something tall and strong had leaned on them or brushed against them. It all looked fresh, too fresh to ignore. I walked to my car and opened the door. Before getting in, I felt something make me look back at the cabin. On the far side of it, near the woods, the ground was disturbed the same way it was near the graveyard. Dragged earth, broken branches, long footprints leading between the trees. Whatever had been moving around that place wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or anything out of a story. It was something real, something with weight, height, strength, and a reason to wander near that graveyard every night. Maybe it was someone living out there, hiding from people, surviving off the land in a way that twisted them into something unrecognizable. Maybe it was someone who didn't want strangers near that old cabin or near those graves. Or maybe it was someone who had been living out in the woods for so many years that they didn't act like a normal person anymore. I didn't stay to find out. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back again. The entire time, all the way down the dirt road, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see that tall shape coming out of the treeline. I never went back to Ridgeton, and I never rented a cabin again. I learned something important on that trip. Silence can be dangerous. The woods can hide things that don't want to be found, and graveyards aren't always the quietest places on the land. Some places hold the kind of people who don't want to be seen, who move at night, and who watch from a distance until you leave. And I'm glad I left when I did, because I knew if I had stayed one more night, whatever was out there would have come closer, much closer. I didn't plan on ending up at that cabin, not that summer of 2007 in northern Montana. I had just turned 21, full of restless energy and a need to escape the city for a while. I'd driven north for weeks, following the highways into stretches of road where trees swallowed everything in green and the occasional town appeared like a fleeting mirage. I liked being alone, away from people, away from responsibility, and I wanted a place where no one would even think to check on me. I remember finding the cabin on a back road that hardly looked like a road at all. The GPS had long stopped being useful, and I was relying on instinct and the vague directions from a crumpled map I bought in a gas station 2 towns back. The cabin itself was tucked in a small clearing, surrounded by dense pine and spruce. It looked abandoned at first glance, the wood dark and weathered, shingles missing in odd patches, the roof sagging slightly like it had given up holding itself up. Windows were grimy, partially broken, and the front door leaned on its hinges as if it were barely attached. The first thing I noticed when I stepped onto the porch was the smell. A thick, earthy rot mixed with the sharp tang of mold. The wood groaned under my weight, and I could see small animals had made tunnels in the corners and under the floorboards. I had a flashlight and a backpack, but nothing prepared me for just how empty and isolated that place felt. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting it to collapse entirely. The cabin smelled worse inside. Dust and rot filled the air, and the sunlight that crept through the broken windows barely touched the far corners of the room. The interior was worse than I imagined. Old furniture was scattered about as though someone had left in a hurry decades ago. A rusted metal bed frame lay on its side, the mattress long rotted away. Drawers were pulled out and tipped over, their contents long gone or reduced to mold and dust. I noticed a layer of grime over everything, and tiny spiders had spun webs in the corners of the ceiling. A fireplace sat cold in the main room, the soot blackened and cracked, like no fire had burned there for years. I had a strange feeling stepping further inside, a tightness in my chest that wasn't just from the smell or the dust. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to shake it off and started inspecting. There was a small kitchen area with a sink full of old leaves and dirt. A few cabinets hung crooked on the wall, doors missing or dangling. The floorboards creaked under every step, and I felt the weight of the cabin shift slightly with me, as if it didn't want me there. I found a staircase leading up to what must have been a loft. Each step groaned under my weight. The loft was small, more like an attic, with a low ceiling and a single tiny window letting in a thin beam of light. The floor was covered in broken glass, old newspapers, and what looked like shredded fabric. There was an old trunk pushed into the corner. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside were clothes, threadbare and discolored with age, and a few personal items. A cracked pocket watch, a leather-bound notebook, and a pair of leather gloves stiffened with age. I couldn't make out the writing in the notebook. It was faded and water-damaged, but there was a strange sense of presence in the room, like the cabin itself was aware someone was rifling through its things. I decided that night to stay. I set up my sleeping bag in what remained of the main room, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept my flashlight close, and I made a small fire in the fireplace after clearing years of soot and debris. Smoke filled the room at first, stinging my eyes and throat, but eventually, it cleared enough to give a thin layer of warmth. That night was when things got truly unsettling. I had been reading an old map by flashlight, planning the next day's hike, when I heard a sound from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate. A step on the porch. I froze, my heart hammering. Then another. Footsteps, slow and dragging, moving around the cabin. I didn't dare open the door. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, holding them tight, listening. The footsteps stopped suddenly. For a long time, there was only silence, but the silence was heavy, pressing down like a physical weight. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, raccoons maybe, or a stray dog. But then I heard something else. Faint scraping, like claws or a stick being dragged along the wood outside. It circled the cabin once, twice. I wanted to call out, but the thought of someone or something answering froze my tongue. I stayed awake all night, flashlight clutched to my chest, listening to every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside. Morning brought relief. The sun broke through the trees, and the sounds outside returned to normal. Birds chirping, whined through the pines, a distant stream trickling. I told myself I had imagined it. Exhaustion and fear can do that to a person. But the sense of unease didn't leave me. I spent the next day carefully exploring the perimeter. I found signs that someone or something had been there recently. A small campsite behind the cabin, a few broken bottles, and footprints that didn't look entirely human, elongated with a strange spread of toes. I couldn't explain it, but I decided I wasn't going to let it stop me. I packed lightly, bringing food, water, and the flashlight, prepared for a long hike in the forest around the cabin. The real horror came that night. I woke to the sound of something scraping against the walls, closer than before. My flashlight revealed nothing, but shadows moved across the room as though someone was just out of sight. I stayed still, barely breathing, until I realized the sound wasn't moving anymore. I forced myself to move toward the door, every step careful, listening. Outside, the forest was quiet, too quiet. My gut told me to leave, and I did. I packed quickly at first light, but I noticed something as I opened the door. On the porch, pressed into the wood with mud, were footprints, barefoot. They circled the cabin at least 3 times and then stopped, leading back into the forest. They were larger than mine, too long to be human without stretching the imagination. I didn't wait to think. I grabbed my bag, jumped into my car, and drove without stopping for hours. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at the gas station, hands shaking as I bought coffee and checked the map. I never went back to the cabin, and I never told anyone about the footprints. Some things I decided are better left alone. Years later, I learned the area had a reputation. Locals whispered about trespassers who vanished in the woods, and abandoned cabins with signs of recent occupation. Some thought it was just hunters or squatters. Others speculated more. I don't know what I saw that night, and I'm not sure I want to. But I do know one thing. No logical explanation could erase the memory of that cabin, the weight of its silence, or the fear that pressed against me as if the building itself was alive. Even now, driving through Montana, I avoid the back roads. I can't shake the image of the cabin, dark and waiting, with those footprints pressed into the wood as if someone, or something, had been watching me, waiting for me to leave. And I will never forget the sound of those slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin in the dark. I hadn't been back to the woods since I was a teenager. Not since the summers the first spent with my uncle in Vermont. But something about the quiet called me this time. A tired pull after a year of endless noise and city life. I drove up the winding roads in late October, the trees lining the mountains already bare, their branches black against a gray sky. The cabin was my grandfather's, left to me after he died, though I hadn't stepped inside in over 10 years. The GPS barely worked once I left the last town behind, and I had to rely on old maps I'd printed months ago. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, nearly hidden from the main road by a wall of pines and maples. I pulled up in front of the weathered structure, my tires crunching over dry leaves and gravel. It smelled immediately of earth and decay, that musty scent that comes from buildings left closed up for too long. I parked and stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The air was cold, sharper than I expected, and a stiff wind rattled the boards along the roof. The cabin had aged worse than I remembered. The wood was dark and spotted with water stains, and some of the boards along the porch had rotted away. The windows were grimy and opaque, and I could see only shadows inside. I had brought nothing with me except a backpack with food, some clothes, and a flashlight. I unlocked the door with the old brass key that my grandfather had given me years ago, the one I had kept on a chain around my neck. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, The air was heavy and cold. Dust hung in beams in the faint sunlight filtering through the dirt-streaked windows. I took my first step inside and felt the floorboards groan beneath me. The cabin smelled of mildew, wood rot, and something else, a faint metallic scent that I couldn't place. I set my backpack down and started checking the rooms. The living room still had the old stone fireplace, the stones blackened from years of soot. There was an armchair in the corner, worn and cracked, with stuffing peeking out at the seams. The kitchen was worse. Cabinets hung on their hinges, some doors missing entirely, and the sink was rusted. I lit a small propane heater I had brought and set it in the middle of the living room. The warmth spread slowly, but it helped push back the damp chill that clung to my clothes. I unpacked a few essentials and set up my sleeping area in the corner, using an old mattress I had found under a pile of tarps. As the afternoon faded, shadows lengthened across the cabin. The trees outside swayed in the wind, scraping against the walls like fingernails. Around late afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding land. The property was bigger than I remembered, stretching down toward a small creek and up into a steep ridge behind the cabin. The underbrush was thick, and the fallen leaves made the ground slippery. I kept a careful pace, my boots crunching over branches and dry leaves. It felt strange being out here alone, so quiet except for the occasional rustle of a bird or a squirrel in the trees. As the sun dipped lower, the woods seemed to darken faster than I expected. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky had already turned a deep gray, and the wind had picked up. I locked the door behind me and turned on a small battery lantern I kept on the counter. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a bundle of old clothes or a fallen chair. But then I saw the outline clearly. A body, slumped in the corner behind the stove. My heart stopped. The cold metallic smell was stronger here. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. The closer I got, the more obvious it became. The body wasn't human, at least not alive anymore. Its skin was gray and stretched tight, clothes matted with dirt and blood that had dried into dark crusts. It was a man, probably in his 30s, though time had distorted the features. The way he was twisted against the wall suggested he had fallen, maybe been hiding or crawling, and never made it back up. My stomach turned. How had I not noticed this before? I ran to the phone to call 911, but there was no signal. My mind raced. The nearest town was nearly 40 minutes away, and night was coming fast. I took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. First, I had to make sure there were no other threats. I checked the windows and doors, and nothing moved outside except the wind. The man's body was alone. Whoever he had been, he hadn't been there recently, maybe weeks, maybe months. His death seemed like an accident or a bad turn of luck if he had been living rough in the woods. I found a pair of gloves in the cabin and carefully moved a chair to cover him, making it less likely I'd step on him or disturb anything. Then I stepped outside, letting the wind hit my face, and tried to calm down. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin alone with the body all night. The lantern wouldn't last, and I didn't want to be trapped inside in the dark. I grabbed my backpack and headed to the ridge behind the cabin, hoping to make some sort of signal or at least stay visible if someone came looking. As the night fell, I saw headlights in the distance. Relief hit me hard. I ran down to the main road, waving my arms. A sheriff's truck slowed and stopped, and I explained everything as quickly as I could. They followed me back to the cabin. When they saw the body, they radioed for backup. I watched from a distance, shivering in the cold, as they examined the scene, took pictures, and eventually covered the body with a proper sheet. It wasn't the kind of closure anyone could imagine. It was grim, silent, and final, but at least it was official. The officers told me that the man had been living in the woods for weeks, possibly trying to survive without anyone noticing. They weren't sure how he had died, exposure, injury, or a combination. The cabin had hidden him perfectly, I stayed until they had taken him away, and then I finally stepped inside once more. The smell was still there, but now it was mixed with the faint scent of bleach as they had cleaned a small area near the door. I walked slowly through the rooms, looking at the furniture, the fireplace, the broken cabinets. It was still my grandfather's cabin, still a place I could use, but I realized just how fragile life could be, even in the quietest, most isolated places. I stayed the night, sleeping in a makeshift bed near the window. The wind rattled the roof, and leaves scraped against the walls, but I felt safer knowing that I wasn't alone, that someone knew about the body and that help had been there. In the morning, I packed my things and walked down to the road. I called a local service to come and secure the cabin properly, and I made sure the sheriff had all the information they needed. I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief, knowing the man was gone, but that at least his death had been acknowledged. Driving back down the winding roads, I thought about the cabin and the woods. They were still beautiful, still quiet, but I carried the memory with me. The sharp smell of decay, the cold weight of fear, and the reminder that the wilderness could be as dangerous as it was peaceful. I knew I would come back one day, better prepared, but the first night had left its mark. Life in the woods was raw, unfiltered, and real. There were no fairy tales here, no ghosts, just the undeniable fact of survival and sometimes of failure. The experience stayed with me, etched into my memory. I started keeping a small emergency kit in my car, and I learned to notice the subtle signs of life or death in the woods. When I finally returned months later, the cabin felt different, less like a forgotten place and more like a reminder of how fragile and precious life could be. And somehow, knowing that someone had been there and that I had helped in some small way gave me a strange sense of closure. It was real, harsh, and final, but in the end, it was also clear. I remember that night more clearly than most days in my life, even though it happened years ago, back in 2014, when I was 26. I had driven deep into the northern hills of Montana, trying to get a weekend away from everything. Work, noise, traffic, the constant pressure of city life. I rented a small cabin I found online, one that looked old but solid enough, tucked far back in a line of tall pine trees. The listing had only a few photos, and all of them were taken on bright, sunny days, so I never really got a sense of what the place looked like under bad weather. I thought that wouldn't matter. I thought I was going to have a quiet, peaceful 2 days of rest. The rain started halfway through my drive up the long gravel road that led into the woods. At first, it was a light tapping on the windshield, nothing unusual. But then it turned into heavy, sharp drops that made the glass vibrate. The road became muddy, and my tires kicked up wet dirt on both sides. There were no streetlights, no houses, nothing but the thick, dark shapes of trees pressing close to the road. The sky looked almost purple, swollen with heavy clouds that blocked out every star. I had this sinking feeling in my stomach, like I was entering a place I shouldn't be, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was tired, that I just wasn't used to this kind of loneliness. By the time I reached the cabin, the rain had turned into a complete downpour. The cabin sat in a small clearing, with tall grass growing up around its sides and an old wooden deck that had turned gray from years of weather. The roof looked uneven, like some parts sagged more than others, and one of the windows had a board nailed across it. That wasn't in the photos. I figured maybe the owner just didn't bother updating the listing. When I stepped out of the car, the cold rain hit me like a sheet of ice. My jacket soaked through in seconds. The wind pushed the rain sideways, making it slap against my face and neck. The trees swayed sharply in the wind, their branches making low, moaning sounds that carried through the clearing. The whole place smelled like wet soil, pine, and old wood. Inside, the cabin was even older than it looked from the outside. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been opened in weeks. The floorboards creaked under every step. The living room had a small couch with stuffing poking out of one corner, and a coffee table that looked like someone had once dropped something heavy on it. The windows were streaked with rain, and the only source of light came from a weak lamp in the corner. I turned it on, and the bulb flickered for several seconds before turning steady. The sound of the rain hitting the roof echoed through the room in a steady, heavy rhythm. I went to unpack a few things, but the whole time I kept noticing little details that made me uneasy. There were scratches on the inside of the front door, long and shallow, like someone had dragged metal across it. The floor in the small kitchen had darker patches in the wood that didn't match the rest of the boards. The fridge buzzed loudly, even though it was nearly empty. The bathroom mirror had a crack running through the center, and the sink had rust stains underneath the faucet. None of these things were dangerous, but they added together to create a feeling I couldn't shake. A feeling that something was off. I tried to distract myself by preparing a small dinner, but the storm kept getting louder. The wind whipped against the walls, and every few minutes the cabin groaned in a slow, deep way, as if the wind were pushing it off its foundation. At one point, I heard something large fall outside. I looked through the nearest window, but the rain was so heavy that I couldn't see more than a few feet into the dark. Everything outside was blurred and shifting. The forest looked alive in a way I didn't like. Hours passed. The storm didn't weaken at all. I sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me, listening to the rain and trying to focus on a book I had brought. But my eyes kept drifting away from the words. I couldn't stop glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something standing just outside. I didn't know why I felt that way. I told myself it was just the atmosphere, the isolation, the fact that the cabin didn't feel like it belonged to me. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard something that didn't match the rhythm of the rain. A sharp, quick set of thuds on the deck outside. Not the wind, not falling branches. These were footsteps, heavy ones. Someone or something was walking right across the deck, right past the front door. I froze. I didn't breathe. The sound moved slowly, step by step, from one side of the cabin to the other. The boards creaked under the weight. I sat completely still, every muscle locked. My mind raced through every logical explanation I could think of. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe the shifting old wood caused an illusion of footsteps. But the sound was too distinct, too clear. They were footsteps, slow ones. They stopped near the back corner of the cabin. I didn't dare move. I waited, staring at the lamp, listening to the rain roar over the roof. After a long moment, I heard another sound, something brushing against the wall. A dragging noise, like someone running their hand or fingers or something rough across the wooden planks. The sound traveled along the exterior wall, slow and steady. My heartbeat thudded so loudly in my chest I could feel it in my throat. I waited for the sound to stop, but it didn't. It moved all the way to the back door, then faded. The only thing left was the rain. I sat awake for hours after that. Every sound felt amplified. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made me flinch. I didn't want to move from the couch, but staying still made me feel trapped. I didn't want to go outside, but being inside didn't feel safe either. Eventually, the storm began to lessen. The rain softened to a steady drizzle, and the wind calmed. The darkness outside the windows felt less dense. I watched the sky slowly lighten, the night turning into a dull gray morning. When the rain finally stopped, I gathered enough courage to step outside. The air was cold and heavy, filled with the smell of wet pine. I walked around the cabin, my shoes sinking into the soft, soaked ground. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints. Not animal tracks. Bare footprints. Large ones. They were pressed deep into the wet soil, forming a trail that circled the entire cabin. The prints were wide, with long toes, and they looked fresh. Whoever left them had walked barefoot in the freezing rain, in the middle of the night, all the way around the building. They weren't spaced like someone running or stumbling. They were evenly placed, calm, steady. They led from the tree line around the cabin and then back into the trees on the opposite side. I felt a cold wave move through my body. I knew then that the footsteps I heard weren't just in my head. Someone had been out there. Someone had walked right up to the cabin, close enough to touch the walls, close enough to look in through the windows if they wanted. I packed everything inside as fast as I could. I didn't bother making breakfast. I didn't bother checking the cabin again. I threw everything into the car and started driving back down the long wet road before the sky was even fully bright. When I reached the main highway, my hands were shaking so hard it felt like I could barely keep the steering wheel straight. I didn't report anything. I didn't call the cabin owner. I didn't tell anyone for a long time because I didn't have proof of anything. All I had was the memory of those heavy footsteps on the deck, the dragging sound on the wall, and the clear prints in the mud the next morning. But even now, years later, I still think about it. I think about how calm and slow those footsteps were. I think about how the prints circled the cabin once, but never stopped at a door or window long enough to leave deeper marks, as if whoever it was didn't need to look inside, as if they already knew I was in there. That was the last time I ever rented a cabin in the woods. I still enjoy quiet places, still like getting away from the city, but I make sure I never stay anywhere that isolated again. And every time it rains at night, even when I'm safe inside my own home, I sometimes hear the faint echo of footsteps on old wooden boards. I know it's only in my head, but I also know what I heard that night was real, and that is enough to keep me from ever going back. I had been a park ranger in the northern stretches of Montana for over 6 years, and I thought I had seen almost everything the wilderness could throw at a person. I had spent months alone at remote outposts, hiking miles of dense forest, inspecting trails, checking for wildlife activity, and occasionally rescuing lost hikers. But nothing in all those years had prepared me for the week I spent at the Elkhorn Ranger Cabin in the summer of 2007. The cabin sat deep in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, almost completely cut off from the rest of the park. Its wooden walls were weathered, bleached gray by the sun and scarred by decades of snowstorms. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the front porch leaned to one side, giving it a lopsided appearance that somehow made it feel even lonelier. A small chimney rose from the back, though I had to rely on firewood I chopped myself. There was no electricity beyond the occasional solar panel that powered a single flickering lantern inside. I arrived just as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and the air was already thick with mosquitoes. The forest smelled like damp earth and pine, sharp and clinging to the back of your throat. I parked my truck on the barely visible dirt track, unlocked the cabin, and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the last light that filtered through the single cracked window. The smell of old wood, smoke, and a faint trace of mildew hit me instantly. It wasn't unpleasant. This was normal for a cabin like this, but it immediately reminded me that I was alone, completely alone. I spent the first evening unpacking my gear. I stacked the firewood, checked my supplies, and filled the water jug from the stream nearby, filtering it before bringing it in. The cabin had the basics: a small cot, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove. I lit the stove to warm the place, feeling the heat slowly push back against the cold that seeped from the forest. I always kept my sidearm close and my flashlight within reach, a habit drilled into me by years of solo patrols. The first night passed without incident, though I remember lying awake listening to the forest. The sounds of wind through the pines, the distant howl of a coyote, and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of some unseen creature kept me alert. The next day, I set out to check the perimeter of the cabin and the surrounding trails. The forest was dense and tangled, and the deeper I went, the more I felt that uncanny stillness of true isolation. Birds called to each other, but the further I walked, the quieter it became. By late afternoon, I had reached a small clearing where I often spotted deer, but this time the silence felt heavier. I shrugged it off as nerves, though I noticed odd signs. Broken branches at odd heights, footprints that didn't quite match any animal I knew. They were elongated, with claw marks that looked almost human, but I told myself I was imagining things. I marked the trail and returned to the cabin just before dusk. That night was the beginning of what I would later realize was one of the scariest stretches of my life. Around 11 p.m., while the wind rattled the cabin windows, I heard a sound outside that made my stomach tighten. A soft, deliberate crunching of leaves. I froze, listening. It wasn't the wind. It was something moving. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly peered through the window. Nothing. Just the black silhouettes of the pines, swaying gently. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart thumped in my chest. I kept my sidearm on the table and silently reached for my walkie-talkie, hoping to get a signal. Of course, there was none. I cursed under my breath. This cabin was isolated for a reason. Cell towers didn't reach here. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard it, soft scraping against the wooden porch. I shined my flashlight at the door and saw nothing. My rational mind kept telling me it was probably a raccoon or a bear, though neither made that kind of sound. Still, I checked the locks and sat down, shaking, waiting for whatever it was to go away. Hours passed, and eventually, the forest fell silent again. The following day, I tried to focus on routine checks, but unease gnawed at me. I noticed fresh tracks near the cabin. Large, boot-like prints, deep and heavy. They weren't mine, and they hadn't been there the day before. I followed them a short distance into the woods, my hand hovering over my sidearm. They led to the stream behind the cabin and then disappeared. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken branches, no signs of struggle. Yet the feeling of being watched never left me. That night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps started around 2 a.m., circling the cabin slowly. I didn't move. My flashlight was on, pointing at the door, and I kept my finger on the trigger. Then I heard a low, guttural growl. Not animal, at least not one I could identify. Something heavy moved across the porch. My blood ran cold. I realized then that whatever it was, it knew I was inside, and it wasn't afraid. I waited, frozen, as the sound slowly faded into the distance. By dawn, the tracks were gone. Over the next couple of days, I stayed mostly inside the cabin. I reinforced the windows and doors, set up makeshift alarms, tripwires with cans, and kept the fire burning at all times. I rationed food and water carefully. The forest felt like it had shifted. It was no longer just a place of wildlife and quiet. It felt predatory. One morning, I found my truck's tires slashed, deep gashes cutting the rubber clean through. Whoever or whatever was out there, it had been watching me. On the sixth night, I decided I had to leave before things escalated further. I packed my gear quietly, keeping my sidearm ready, and prepared for a hike down to the nearest ranger station, over 15 miles away through dense, uneven terrain. I left before dawn, moving cautiously, stepping over roots and fallen logs, scanning constantly. About halfway down, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were behind me. I ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, lungs burning. I dared a glance back and saw a figure in dark clothing, impossibly still and blending into the trees. I ran until I could see the road that led to the ranger station. The figure didn't follow me onto the road, but the fear lingered like a shadow. I made it to the station by late morning, shaken and exhausted, and reported everything. Rangers went back to check the cabin, but they found nothing out of the ordinary, except for the slashed tires, some scattered footprints that disappeared into the forest, and the unmistakable feeling that someone had been watching me. Weeks later, when I returned to that cabin with a team, we found evidence that people had been living in the woods nearby. Makeshift shelters, discarded food, and crude traps. The locals later told me stories about a couple of men who had been hiding in the wilderness, evading authorities for years. They were dangerous, but rarely violent unless provoked. The sounds, the footsteps, the growls. It had all been them, observing me, testing my limits, keeping me on edge. I never went back to the elk horn cabin alone again. The wilderness had always been unpredictable, but that week taught me a lesson. Danger doesn't always wear a uniform or leave clear signs. Sometimes, it watches silently from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And sometimes, the only thing standing between you and harm is vigilance, preparation, and the ability to keep moving until you reach safety. Even now, when I drive past the edges of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, I think about that cabin. The pines stand the same, the streams still run clear, but I know that somewhere in that forest, the memory of those footsteps lingers, and the eyes that watched me from the dark are still out there. I survived, but it's a survival that never quite leaves you. I hadn't been back to Lakewood in nearly 10 years. The small town in northern Maine had always felt like a quiet, suffocating place, especially after my divorce from Mark. When I heard the news of his death, I didn't know why I felt compelled to return. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was some strange sense of closure I needed. He had left behind a cabin in the woods near the edge of the lake, a small, weathered structure he'd built himself, tucked deep in the pine forest, away from the main road. I decided I would go see it, if only to make sense of the past I'd left behind. I drove the old Subaru up the narrow, twisting road that led to the lake. The trees pressed close on either side, branches clawing at the car as if they were alive, leaving dark streaks on the windshield from the heavy frost of early December. The sun had already dipped low in the sky by the time I reached the turnoff to the cabin. The sign marking the path was half buried in snow, leaning crookedly. I parked and stepped out, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. The cold hit me instantly, sharp and biting, making my nose sting and my fingers ache despite the thick gloves. The cabin itself was smaller than I remembered, its wooden walls gray and rough from decades of weather. Windows were dusty, some cracked, letting a faint draft escape. The roof sagged slightly on one side, weighed down by layers of snow. Even from a distance, the place looked abandoned, untouched for years. I felt a strange mix of apprehension and resolve as I walked up to the door. I hadn't set foot inside since the divorce, since the arguments, the shouting, the last night I'd left for good. The door was unlocked, as if waiting for me. I pushed it open slowly. The air inside smelled of damp wood and old smoke, the kind that sticks to everything over time. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the floor. There was a fireplace at one end, filled with cold ashes, and a small kitchen area with rusted utensils and cracked dishes. The furniture was sparse, old, and covered in dust. A sense of stillness pressed in, almost suffocating, broken only by the faint creaks of the floorboards beneath my boots. I started walking through the cabin, touching the edges of counters and tables, noticing the little things I had long since forgotten. The scratches on the wooden table where he used to carve his initials, the marks on the wall from where he had leaned a broom, the old calendar pinned on the wall, frozen on a month from years ago. Everything was frozen in time, like a photograph that had yellowed and curled at the edges. I went up to the small bedroom at the back. The bed was stripped down to a lumpy mattress, the sheets long gone. I sat on the edge, feeling the springs groan beneath me, and I noticed the floor around the bed was warped, water damage from a leaky roof. There were still boxes stacked in the corner, untouched since he moved out of town. One of them had his old journals. I hesitated, then pulled it out, dust flying into the air. The entries were mostly mundane at first, notes about fishing trips, work in the nearby town, the occasional complaint about me or our life together. But then, around the third page, I noticed a shift. His handwriting became sharper, more erratic. There were references to sounds outside at night, footsteps on the frozen lake, the creak of trees bending in unnatural ways. He mentioned checking the doors multiple times, setting traps, locking windows. He wrote about leaving the cabin for hours at a time to clear things up. Though what that meant, I couldn't tell. Reading those pages, I felt my stomach tighten. I had been curious about his fears, but seeing them laid bare, so close to where he had lived, made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The wind had picked up outside. The pines groaned under the weight of snow, and the lake, just visible through the cabin window, was a flat, gray sheet, reflecting nothing. I walked back to the main room, careful to avoid the loose floorboards. The back door rattled in its frame, and I froze, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, just the way the cabin shifted in the cold. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to check the cellar. Mark had always been meticulous about his small workshop there. The stairs were narrow, wooden, and steep, groaning ominously under my weight. I flicked on my flashlight and descended. The smell hit me immediately: mold, old chemicals, rust. Tools hung from hooks on the walls, all coated in dust, and old fishing equipment leaned in corners. I moved carefully, stepping over boxes that threatened to tip over. Then I saw it. A small pile of wood in the far corner, neatly stacked, with fresh scratch marks on the floor nearby. My heart began to race. I turned the flashlight toward the door, scanning for any explanation. That's when I noticed the footprints. Small, muddy prints leading from the door into the back of the cellar. I cursed under my breath, telling myself it must have been an animal. A raccoon, maybe something that had crawled in when the cabin was open. Still, the prints were deeper than I would expect from a small animal, and they weren't scattered. They were deliberate, careful, like someone had walked straight through. I climbed back up, unease settling into my bones. My flashlight flickered for a second, then went out, leaving me in darkness. I fumbled for the matches I always carried in my jacket pocket and lit a candle on the counter. Its small flame threw dancing shadows across the walls. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, suffocating, as if the shadows themselves were moving closer. I forced myself to take slow breaths, telling myself that this was just the cabin settling, the wind rattling the boards. Night fell fully, and the temperature dropped further. I covered myself in the old quilt I found in the bedroom, trying to calm the sense of dread crawling along my spine. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the wind continued to whisper through the trees. Hours passed slowly. Every creak, every groan of the cabin sounded like footsteps approaching. I tried to distract myself, flipping through more of Mark's journals, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. I realized I had been holding my breath, waiting for something that might never come. At around 2 a.m., I decided I had enough. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with the oppressive weight of history pressing down on me, not with the fear that my mind was conjuring shadows in every corner. I packed up what I wanted to take, mostly journals and a few old photographs, and made my way back to the car. The snow crunched under my boots, the silence of the woods complete except for the occasional snap of a branch. The cabin grew smaller behind me as I walked, its windows like dark, observing eyes. When I reached the road, I paused and looked back. The cabin seemed almost peaceful in the moonlight now, quiet and unremarkable. The fear I had felt inside began to dissipate, replaced by a solemn clarity. Mark was gone, the cabin was empty, and whatever had haunted me there, the memories, the echoes of arguments, the lingering tension of our failed life, was tied to the past. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away. By the time I reached the main highway, the first hints of dawn were breaking over the trees. I felt a strange relief, a weight lifted from my shoulders. The fear, the cabin, Mark, it was all behind me. I knew I would carry some of it with me, like a scar, but it would no longer control me. The road stretched ahead, open and quiet, leading to a life that was entirely mine again. The cabin would stand there, frozen in time, silent and abandoned, as it always had, and I finally could leave it behind. It was the spring of 2017 when my boss, Leonard, decided it would be a good idea for the two of us to take a weekend retreat to his remote cabin in northern Maine. I had been working under him for almost 5 years, mostly in an office cubicle with fluorescent lights buzzing above, and the thought of leaving the city behind for a couple of days sounded appealing. Leonard had described the cabin as rustic but comfortable, a place where we could brainstorm ideas away from the chaos of the office. What he didn't mention was how completely isolated it was. The drive itself was longer than I expected. We left Portland in the late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows over the road as we drove through narrow country lanes. Leonard's old Jeep rattled over uneven pavement and potholes, and the headlights barely cut through the dense forest lining both sides of the road. There were stretches where no other cars passed for miles, and the further we drove, the more the world seemed to shrink down to the two of us and the thick, dark woods pressing against the windows. The cabin was hidden at the end of a winding gravel driveway. When we finally arrived, the sun had completely disappeared behind the treetops, leaving the woods in near darkness. The cabin itself was small, built of dark timber with a steeply pitched roof and a stone chimney that hadn't seen smoke in a long time. The front porch sagged slightly in the middle, and weeds had crept up through the cracks in the decking. It had a certain charm, but also an undeniable feeling of abandonment, as though it had been forgotten by time. Leonard didn't seem to notice, though. He was excited, practically bouncing as he jumped out of the Jeep. Inside, the cabin was sparse. There was a small living area with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom with 2 twin beds. The furniture was old, rough-hewn, and covered in dust, and the smell of damp wood and mildew lingered in the air. I followed Leonard around as he inspected the place, feeling a mix of unease and fascination. There was no cell service, he mentioned casually, and the nearest town was over 30 miles away. For someone like me, who relied on constant connectivity, the thought of being cut off from the world was unsettling, but Leonard seemed to revel in it. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The wind howled outside, whipping through the trees and making the cabin creak and groan. At first, I tried to focus on the simplicity of it, reading a few pages from the book I had brought, but the darkness outside the window pressed against me like a physical weight. Every little sound, the scratching of branches, the distant thump of something in the underbrush, made me flinch. Leonard, for his part, seemed completely at ease, moving around the cabin without a hint of caution. He started a fire in the stove, and the warm, flickering light made the shadows on the walls dance in strange, distorted ways. Around midnight, I woke to a sharp noise, something heavy hitting the cabin wall. I froze, listening. It came again, a dull thud, like a branch or perhaps an animal, but the timing was off, deliberate almost. Leonard was asleep, his deep, even breathing filling the other side of the room. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, straining to hear more, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and peered out the window. The forest was black, except for the thin slice of moonlight cutting through the trees. I saw a movement, a figure crouched low, moving silently between the trunks. My heart raced. It had to be someone or something, but there was no sign of tracks or a path, just trees and darkness. The next morning, I suggested we take a walk, though I tried to keep my voice casual. Leonard agreed enthusiastically, carrying his old rifle just in case. Though he didn't explain what that meant, we hiked through the woods behind the cabin, and the forest felt even more oppressive in daylight, dense with saplings, fallen logs, and underbrush that snagged at our clothes. Leonard seemed unbothered by the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing. By the afternoon, we returned to the cabin. Leonard busied himself chopping firewood and cleaning up the cabin's small kitchen. I tried to relax, telling myself that maybe the previous night had been my imagination running wild. But then, while gathering some kindling, I noticed the Jeep had a faint scratch on its passenger side door. It was thin, almost like someone had run a key along it, but it was fresh. My stomach sank. Leonard didn't notice or didn't care, and I didn't say anything, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. Night fell again, and it brought the same wind and the same suffocating darkness. The sound of movement outside resumed, but this time it was accompanied by soft, almost deliberate knocks against the walls and windows. Leonard seemed oblivious, reading by the light of the fire, while I sat frozen, watching shadows shift across the room. At some point, the sound stopped, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed on my ears like a physical force. I couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, and when I looked at Leonard, the way he calmly dozed in his bed made me feel a creeping sense of dread. The following morning, I made the decision to leave. I didn't say anything to Leonard, he probably wouldn't have understood. But I packed quickly and insisted we drive back. As we drove down the gravel driveway, I glanced back at the cabin, and for a brief second, I thought I saw someone standing at the treeline watching us. Leonard didn't see it, or he pretended not to. The drive back to Portland was tense, silent, the forest closing in on us like it had all weekend. Weeks later, I found out the cabin had been rented out under different names over the years, each tenant reporting strange noises, scratches on walls, and missing items. Some people assumed it was just wildlife, vandals, or the forest playing tricks on the mind. I never went back to that area, and Leonard never mentioned the cabin again. But every time I drive past a stretch of woods with no civilization in sight, I remember the weight of that darkness, the feeling of being watched, and the faint outline of a figure disappearing between the trees. The experience stayed with me, a quiet reminder of how small and exposed you can feel when you're completely alone in the wrong place. It wasn't a ghost or a storybook monster, just the isolation, the shadows, and the very real possibility that someone or something was out there. That weekend changed how I viewed the outdoors, and even now, I can't look at a remote cabin without a shiver crawling up my spine. I didn't scream, I didn't run, and nothing attacked me. But the memory of the dark, quiet forest and the unknown presence beyond the windows is more terrifying than any supernatural tale I've ever heard. Some things, I realized, are frightening simply because they are real. It was the winter of 2007 when I decided to take a break from the city. I had been working late nights at a law firm in Denver for years, and the constant stress was eating away at me. I needed a place where I could disconnect, breathe fresh air, and just exist without the constant buzz of phones and deadlines. I stumbled upon a small cabin for rent online, tucked away in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. near a town called Westcliff. It was remote, the kind of place where your cell phone barely worked, and the nearest gas station was over an hour away. That alone made it appealing. I arrived in late December, the air cold and sharp, with snow covering the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. The cabin itself was modest, old, with faded wooden walls and a chimney that had clearly seen better days. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and must, but it had a certain charm. The windows were small and grimy, letting in slivers of the pale sunlight. I carried my bag inside, set it on the table, and took a long look around. Everything creaked, the floorboards shifting beneath my weight, reminding me that I wasn't in the city anymore. The first night was quiet, but not peaceful. The wind howled outside, making the cabin groan. I had brought firewood and made a small fire in the stove. The glow of the flames cast shadows across the walls, and I felt comforted by the crackling sound. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside, footsteps crunching on the snow. I paused, listening. There was nothing else, just the wind and the trees shifting. I chalked it up to my imagination and went to bed. The second day, I explored the surroundings. The forest around the cabin was dense, with tall pines and sparse underbrush. There were deer tracks in the snow, maybe a fox or coyote passing through. It felt isolated in the best way. But then I noticed something odd. Tracks that didn't match any animal I knew. They were too large for a coyote, too narrow for a bear, and strangely human-like in shape but with long fingers. They led toward the cabin and then disappeared. I felt a chill, but I shrugged it off. Remote areas have wildlife tracks everywhere. That night, I slept poorly. The wind was stronger, and I kept hearing the occasional snap of twigs or soft shuffling outside. It sounded like something or someone was moving around the cabin. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of scratching at the door. Not frantic, but deliberate, as if someone or something was testing the lock. My heart raced, and I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The scratching stopped. Then, I thought I heard breathing, low, guttural, not human, coming from just outside. I spent the next morning convincing myself I had been imagining things. But that afternoon, while chopping more firewood, I saw something moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it moved differently. There was an unnatural fluidity in its gait, and the shape, it was human-like but wrong. Taller than a man, thin in a way that made its limbs look elongated. Its head was low, almost animalistic. Paused, staring at me for what felt like minutes, though it was probably seconds. Then it disappeared behind a tree. I froze, gripping the axe, my mind racing. I tried to stay rational. It was probably a person, someone living off the grid, maybe a hunter or a drifter. But even as I told myself that, the unease in my gut didn't go away. That night, the sounds outside returned, more deliberate this time. I could hear something walking around the perimeter of the cabin, slow and careful, testing me. I refused to look out the window. I spent hours sitting by the fire, flashlight in hand, listening. The scratching came again, closer this time, as if the thing had circled the cabin. On the third day, I decided to leave. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. Dead battery. I checked the wires under the hood, and nothing looked tampered with, but I didn't have enough tools or knowledge to fix it out here. Panic began to set in. My phone had no signal, and I realized just how isolated I truly was. The tracks around the cabin had multiplied overnight. It was circling the cabin constantly. There was a sense of intelligence in the way it moved, not just a wild animal acting on instinct. That night, I did something I never thought I would. I stayed up, awake, with an axe in hand. The sounds started again, the shuffling, the snapping of branches. Then came the low growl, almost a whisper, coming from right outside the cabin. I pressed my back to the wall, trying not to make a sound. The door rattled slightly, as if it was testing the wood. And then I saw it through the narrow window slit, its eyes reflecting the firelight from my stove. The creature's face was human-like in shape but twisted, almost grotesque. His body shifted unnaturally, like it wasn't fully human. I knew then what I was dealing with. Stories I had dismissed as myths, skinwalkers, creatures that could imitate humans and move with terrifying speed and stealth, suddenly didn't feel like stories. I couldn't explain it, but my survival instincts kicked in. I stayed completely still, hoping it would leave. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Eventually, the sound of movement faded. I didn't sleep at all that night, clutching the axe, listening to every snap of a branch, every gust of wind. Morning felt like a small victory. I had survived the night, but I couldn't stay any longer. I decided to walk toward the nearest road, leaving everything behind. The snow was deep, and my legs ached, but I kept moving, following faint trails I hoped would lead to safety. The forest was eerily quiet, no tracks except my own, until I reached a ridge overlooking the road. That's when I saw it watching me from the tree line below. It wasn't moving, just observing. I felt its gaze piercing me, and I ran, faster than I ever had, down the slope and onto the road. Eventually, a truck passed by, and I flagged it down, shivering and exhausted. The driver, a local, gave me a ride into town. When I told him where I had stayed, he didn't ask questions, just nodded gravely and warned me never to go back into those woods alone. The cabin, he said, had a reputation among locals. People disappeared, strange things happened, but no one talked about it outside the valley. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I read about a hiker who vanished in that same area. His tracks ended suddenly, just like mine had started to feel before that last night. I realized that the thing in the woods wasn't a myth, at least not entirely. It was real, and it was intelligent, waiting and watching. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, moving silently through the forest. I dream about it sometimes, the way it tilts its head, watching, calculating. I've avoided cabins in the wilderness since then, and I always make sure someone knows exactly where I'm going. The fear I felt that winter isn't gone. It's just buried under the routines of daily life. But I know, if I ever find myself alone in a forest at night, that feeling will come roaring back, because whatever I saw in that cabin, it wasn't human, and it was patient enough to wait. I remember the week in late October of 1997 like it was yesterday, even though I was only 22 at the time. I had driven up to the northern forests of Minnesota for a hunting trip I had been planning all year. The drive alone was enough to make me feel like I was leaving the real world behind. Endless stretches of dense pine, birch, and maple trees, the air growing colder and heavier the further north I went. I'd rented a small hunting cabin through an older local, a man named Ray who had warned me about the area's remoteness, but in his gravelly voice, he'd sounded more amused than serious. "Stay on the trails, keep your wits about you," he said, handing over the keys. "Cabin's solid, but things happen up here." The cabin itself was deeper in the woods than I expected, tucked away down a dirt track that was barely wide enough for my old Jeep. It was a small, squat building made of weathered logs, with a tin roof that glinted faintly in the weak October sun. Smoke curled from the old stone chimney, a good sign that someone had been there recently, but it was empty when I arrived. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, pine, and something faintly sour that I assumed came from dampness. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and cobwebs hung from the corners like forgotten curtains. It had the basics: a small wood stove, a crude kitchen area, a bed pushed into the corner, and shelves lined with old cans and jars. The windows were small, and I could see the forest pressing close from every angle. I spent the first day organizing my hunting gear, stacking firewood, and mapping out my route. The forest was quiet in a way that was almost unnatural. Just the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant call of a loon over a small, hidden lake. That evening, after a long day of hiking, I lit the stove, the warmth filling the cabin almost instantly. I cooked some canned beans and a small steak over the stove, savoring the heat and light in the small space. I felt safe. I was alone, yes, but I had planned for this, or so I thought. The first night, I woke several times to the sound of branches snapping outside. The wind was high, shaking the cabin's thin walls, and I convinced myself it was just deer or elk moving through the woods. I had always known the forest could be unnerving at night, and I tried to remind myself of that. By morning, I was tired but relieved to see the sun breaking through the trees, painting the cabin's worn exterior in golden light. I went out to hunt, the crisp air filling my lungs, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. That afternoon, something happened that I can't explain logically, though I've tried 100 times since. I was following a deer trail along a steep slope, my boots sinking into the soft earth, when I noticed something odd. A series of footprints that didn't match any animal I knew. They were human-like, but too elongated with irregular spacing, almost as if the person had been running on the balls of their feet. I froze, scanning the trees. The sun was low now, shadows stretching long and dark. The footprints disappeared into the thicker woods, and I debated following them. Part of me wanted to be brave, but a stronger part of me, the part that remembered every survival show I'd ever watched, told me to turn back. I did, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Back at the cabin, I tried to focus on practical matters. Firewood, food, making sure the stove worked. The wind had died down, leaving the forest in a heavy, eerie silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small sound, the whistle of the wind through the trees, the crack of a branch, set my heart racing. I kept the shotgun close, my finger brushing the trigger as I listened to the dark press in from outside. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint scraping noise on the cabin's exterior, something moving deliberately. I froze, holding my breath. My first instinct was to dismiss it as an animal, but the scraping was deliberate, uneven, too heavy to be a deer or a raccoon. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 15 minutes until it stopped. I didn't sleep well after that. When dawn came, I took a careful look around the cabin. Nothing had been disturbed. The firewood stack was intact, the door still locked. Yet I felt the presence of something outside, something observing. I tried to hunt again that morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. By afternoon, I had shot a deer, but retrieving it felt like walking through a gauntlet. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. At one point, I thought I saw someone in the distance, between the trees, just standing and watching. But when I focused, it was gone. I returned to the cabin, heart pounding, deer slung over my shoulder. I locked the door, sat by the stove, and forced myself to eat. The evening passed slowly, with the same strange sounds at the edges of the night. The scraping, the snapping, the faint, deliberate tread of someone moving around outside. I could feel it circling the cabin, not constantly, but enough to make every creak of the floor unbearable. I kept thinking about the footprints I had seen, about the feeling of eyes in the dark. I wondered if someone had been living in these woods, hidden in the trees, watching travelers. On the third day, I decided to leave before I lost my mind. I packed up, making sure everything was in order, and I left the cabin unlocked, as if the previous occupant might return at any moment. The drive back down the rough dirt road was tense. Every noise outside my Jeep seemed amplified. When I reached the main road and civilization, I felt a strange relief, like leaving a trap behind. I called the local sheriff on my way back, trying to explain what I had seen. The footprints, the noises, the feeling of being stalked. The officer was polite, but skeptical. "You probably just got spooked by wildlife," he said. "Deer, elk, wolves. Lots of eyes in the forest." But I knew better. I had hunted enough, been in the woods enough, to know the difference between natural sounds and something deliberate. Years later, I returned to that same area, curious but cautious. I discovered that a hermit had lived in the woods for years, someone who avoided towns entirely. The man had passed away not long before, living entirely off the forest. His cabin had been deeper in the woods than I had thought, and the tracks I had seen, likely his. There had been no supernatural, no fantasy, just a human, alone, surviving, observing. The fear I had felt wasn't magic or a ghost. It was the understanding that I was intruding on someone else's life, someone entirely capable of violence if cornered. The memory of that week remains vivid. The taste of fear, the weight of isolation, the uncanny sounds of someone or something moving deliberately outside the thin walls of a small cabin. That trip taught me more than hunting ever could. How fragile our sense of security really is, and how close the line between safety and danger can be when you step into someone else's wilderness. Even now, I can feel it, that pressing silence, the thought of eyes watching from the shadows. But unlike then, I can understand it. It was real, human, tangible, and I survived it because I stayed calm, cautious, and aware. That cabin, those woods, that presence, they were a reminder that fear doesn't need fantasy. Sometimes it's just the wilderness and the people who live in it watching quietly from the dark. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city. I had been working at a small publishing firm in Chicago for almost 3 years, and the endless noise, deadlines, and fluorescent lights had started to wear me down. I wanted something quiet, someplace far from people, where I could think, write, and just breathe. That's how I ended up driving 6 hours west to a farm cabin tucked in a sparsely populated area of southern Iowa. The place wasn't fancy, nothing more than a weathered wooden shack with peeling paint and a tin roof that had seen better days. But it had a porch that looked out over rolling fields and a small creek running nearby. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The gravel driveway was long and lined with cornstalks that rustled in the evening wind. My car's tires crunched along the stones, and I remember feeling an odd mix of relief and unease. The cabin seemed peaceful, but there was something about the silence that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the usual quiet you get in a park or a suburb. It felt heavy, like the kind of silence that notices you back. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of dust, wood polish, and old smoke. The previous tenant, the owner's uncle, had passed away a year before, and the cabin had been empty since. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the single light bulb in the center of the living area cast weak shadows along the walls. I unpacked my bag, set up my notebook, and tried to shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first night passed without incident. I went to bed early, the hum of the wind outside the only sound. But the second night was different. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. It was soft at first, almost like fingernails on wood, but deliberate, measured. My heart began to pound. I stayed still, straining to hear more. The scraping stopped, then started again, closer to the back door. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and shined it toward the window. There was nothing there, just the dark silhouette of the barn in the distance and the faint outline of cornfields swaying in the wind. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal, but the rational part of my mind didn't feel convincing. Something about the sound, the way it moved, wasn't natural. It wasn't random. It was patient. I spent the rest of the night awake, flashlight in hand, listening. When morning came, the sun cutting sharp lines across the wooden floor, I convinced myself I had imagined it. The day was hot and still, and I wandered around the property, taking in the creaking windmill, the dry cornfields, and the small chicken coop that was empty. I even found footprints in the dirt outside the back of the cabin. They were faint, maybe from a deer or coyote, but they weren't in the pattern I'd expect from an animal. Too deliberate, too human-like. That night, the noises returned. This time, there were footsteps, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I held my flashlight on the door, my fingers trembling around the handle. The steps paused, and I thought I heard breathing, low and quiet, just outside. The fear was suffocating. Couldn't sleep. I stayed huddled in the corner, gripping a kitchen knife I had pulled from the drawer earlier. The footsteps eventually faded, leaving only the wind. The following morning, I noticed something strange. The latch on the back door had been tampered with. It wasn't broken, but it looked like someone had tried to force it open. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. I wanted to leave immediately, but my car wouldn't start. I spent an hour trying, but the engine only clicked. The nearest neighbor was more than a mile away, and the phone line was dead. I was completely isolated. I spent the day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I stacked chairs against the door, secured the windows with pieces of wood I found in the barn, and kept a fire burning in the small stove to signal for anyone passing nearby. The sense of being watched never left me. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the cornfield sounded like footsteps. I kept imagining someone standing just out of sight, watching me, waiting. That night, around 11, I heard the scratching again, but this time, it came from the roof. I froze. Whatever it was moving along the edge of the cabin above me. I grabbed a heavy iron pan from the kitchen and stood in the center of the living area, listening. The scraping continued for a long minute before it stopped abruptly. Then silence. The kind of silence that made the air feel thick. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the first rays of sunlight came through the window, I cautiously stepped outside. The ground around the cabin was covered in prints, boots human-sized. They were fresh, leading from the woods on one side of the property, circling the cabin, and then disappearing toward the back fields. I felt a cold pit in my stomach. Someone had been here, maybe watching me all night, maybe waiting for me to fall asleep. I spent the rest of the day preparing to leave. I gathered all my things, packed up what little food I had left, and decided to walk to the main road. My car was useless, and I didn't want to wait for someone to find me. As I moved cautiously through the cornfields, I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see a figure following, but there was nothing. The fields were empty, the wind carrying only the sound of rustling cornstalks. I finally reached the road and started walking toward the small town about 6 miles away. I didn't stop until I saw a pickup truck approaching, and I waved frantically. The driver slowed and stopped, and I explained, in bursts of breathless words, that someone had been in my cabin, watching me. He looked serious, nodded, and offered me a ride. On the way back, he told me the area had a reputation for people squatting in abandoned buildings and cabins, often hiding out for days or weeks, stealing from properties when the owners weren't around. No one had ever been caught. When I returned to the cabin with the man and the local sheriff, we found nothing inside. No one was hiding, no signs of anyone remaining, only the prints in the dirt, which had now faded in the midday sun. The sheriff told me to take the property off my list for rentals, and I agreed immediately. Couldn't go back. Years later, I sometimes think about that night, the way the silence seemed alive, the way the darkness felt like it had weight. I never found out who had been there or why, But I do know one thing. The fear wasn't imagined. It was real. That cabin, in that lonely part of Iowa, had a presence I couldn't explain. A human presence, deliberate, patient, and close enough that it almost touched me. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural or unreal. Sometimes they're just people. I never went back. The memory lingers, and I've learned to trust it. Now, when I'm out in the country, I pay attention to the quiet, to the subtle movements in the shadows, to the faintest scraping sound. Because I know firsthand that silence can hide someone watching, and not everyone who watches is kind. I remember the drive up to the cabin like it was yesterday, though it was actually the summer of 2012. I was 26, freshly out of a rough breakup, and I thought some time alone in the mountains of northern Idaho would help me breathe again. I had found the cabin online, a small, weathered place tucked away off an unpaved road, far from cell service, with a sign at the turnoff warning about rough roads. I ignored it, thinking it was just a rustic warning, not a literal one. The cabin itself sat at the end of a narrow dirt track, hidden among thick pines. It was old, probably built in the 50s, with faded green paint that was peeling in patches and a tin roof that rattled faintly in the wind. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, and a single rocking chair creaked as if it had a life of its own, though it didn't move. The windows were dusty, streaked from years of rain and snow, and the door handle felt cold and heavy under my hand. Inside, the air smelled of must and old wood. Dust covered the floorboards, and the fireplace was full of gray ashes, unused for months, maybe years. I had brought enough supplies for a week, mostly canned food, bottled water, and a few things I could cook on the small gas stove. The cabin had a single bedroom with a lumpy mattress, a tiny bathroom with a shower that looked like it had seen better days, and a living area with a table, chairs, and a few shelves of forgotten books. The walls were thin, and the silence outside felt almost unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. The first night was the worst. I had set up a small lantern and a flashlight beside the bed. As soon as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the forest seemed to press in around the cabin. The wind whispered through the trees, brushing branches against the roof in sharp, rattling knocks. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but every snap of a twig outside made me jump. My dog, a scrappy terrier mix named Buddy, stayed close to my side, ears perked, low growl rumbling from his throat every few minutes. Around midnight, I was woken by a sound that stopped my heart. It was faint at first, like someone dragging a heavy bag through the underbrush. My eyes shot open, and I strained in the darkness, listening. The sound came again, slower this time, deliberate, circling the cabin. Buddy stiffened beside me, growling sharply. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, but the night was just black. The moon had hidden behind clouds, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, silent except for those soft but purposeful movements. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear, but the dragging, the heavy steps, they didn't sound like anything normal. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel the cabin walls shaking slightly with each distant step, and I realized then how vulnerable I was. There were no neighbors for miles, no cell signal, no way to call for help. My heart raced as I tried to keep calm. I stayed awake the rest of the night, Buddy at my side, flashlight in hand, listening to every snap and rustle. By morning, nothing had happened, and the sunlight felt like a relief, washing away the shadows of the night. I thought about leaving, but I had already driven hours to get here. Part of me wanted to tough it out, to prove I wasn't going to let fear win. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small creek a few hundred feet behind it, some old logging roads, and an abandoned shed overgrown with vines. As I walked, I felt like I was being watched, that something was moving just beyond the trees, keeping pace with me. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, but then I saw the marks, scratches on the bark of a few trees, deep, jagged, as if someone had dragged something heavy against them. And on the ground, strange footprints. They were large, and the toes didn't look quite human. My stomach turned. I went back inside and locked the door. Buddy refused to leave my side. I started to notice more odd things. Objects moved slightly when I wasn't looking. The firewood pile I had stacked outside was slightly rearranged in the morning, and the sounds at night returned, louder now, circling the cabin in the dark. I couldn't sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone, or something, waiting just beyond the walls. On the third night, it happened. I had been sitting at the table, drinking coffee, trying to steady my nerves. Buddy was asleep on the floor. The dragging sound returned, closer this time, heavier, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it outside, and that's when I saw movement in the shadows. A figure crouched low, moving along the treeline. I froze. My stomach dropped. The figure wasn't human, or at least it moved wrong. Long, unnaturally flexible limbs, almost like it was bending in ways a person shouldn't be able to. I backed away slowly, heart hammering, and the figure stopped. I swear it looked at me, though I couldn't see a face. Then it moved again, faster this time, darting from tree to tree, keeping its distance, never coming closer but never leaving. I ran to the door, but Buddy barked and growled, hair standing on end. I could hear my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed in the small bedroom, flashlight on, doors locked, every sound making me jump. By morning, I decided enough was enough. I packed my things quickly, Buddy in my arms, and started the drive back down the mountain. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerging from the forest, following me. The dirt road stretched endlessly, twisting and turning, the forest thick and oppressive on either side. When I finally reached the main highway, I felt a strange relief, almost disbelief that I had made it. I didn't stop for food or gas. I just drove straight back to the nearest town. Once there, I called the local ranger station and told them about the cabin and the strange marks I had seen. They were polite but dismissive, warning me about staying alone in remote areas and advising me not to return. I didn't need convincing. Weeks later, I looked at the photos I had taken. One of the photos, blurry and taken from the cabin window, showed the treeline. In the shadows, a shape crouched, indistinct but unervingly human-like, limbs bent in ways that no human should be able to bend. It was enough to make me never want to return. Years have passed, but I still think about that cabin in Idaho. I never went back, and I never will. I learned that the mountains are beautiful, but they can hide things that don't belong in the world you think you know. That encounter left me with a lesson. Sometimes, the most terrifying things aren't ghosts or monsters from stories. They're just real and close enough to touch. I tell myself that was the last time I would ever stay in a remote cabin alone. I never stayed alone in a place like that again. Buddy passed away a few years later, but I still feel him close when I think back. That summer in Idaho wasn't about ghosts or legends. It was about the primal fear of being hunted, of being completely isolated with something unknown, something dangerous, something alive. And that fear, I've carried with me ever since. I hadn't planned on staying at the cabin for more than a weekend, but somehow I ended up being trapped there for almost 3 days. It was the fall of 2017 when I drove out to northern Vermont, looking for a quiet place to clear my head after a stressful year at my job in Boston. I was 28, tired of the city's constant noise, the fluorescent lights of my office, and the feeling that everyone around me was moving faster than I could keep up with. I found a small listing online for a cabin off the beaten path, advertised as remote, secluded, and surrounded by forest. The photos were basic, slightly grainy, but promising. When I arrived, the cabin was nothing like the pictures. The structure was older than I expected, with chipped paint and a sagging roof that made it look like it might collapse in a strong storm. The porch had a few broken boards, and the surrounding trees pressed close, so dense that the road I had driven on disappeared almost as soon as I left it. I parked my car and stepped out, immediately feeling the difference in the air. The smell of wet leaves, pine needles, and earth was thick, and the wind whispered through the branches in a way that made me uneasy, though I told myself it was just the isolation settling in. The inside of the cabin was small. There was a narrow living area with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen that smelled faintly of mold, and one bedroom with a thin mattress on a lumpy frame. I unpacked my things slowly, noticing how quiet it was. There were no sounds of cars, trains, or airplanes, just the occasional crack of a branch outside. I made a fire in the fireplace, which helped warm the space, but I could hear the draft sneaking through gaps in the walls. The first night, I went to bed early, tired from the drive. The wind picked up after midnight, rattling the windows and making the cabin groan. I slept fitfully, waking every hour or so to the sound of snapping branches or something that might have been an animal brushing against the cabin. By morning, I was restless and decided to explore the surrounding forest. The trees were thick and the ground uneven. Fallen leaves covered roots and rocks, and I stumbled more than once, twisting my ankle slightly. I noticed deer tracks and what looked like the remnants of a fox den, but nothing that alarmed me at first. As I walked, the sun disappeared behind clouds, and the wind carried a chill that cut through my jacket. I realized I had wandered further than I intended, but I wasn't worried until I heard the first sound that truly unnerved me. It was a low, shuffling noise, like someone dragging something across the forest floor. I froze, listening. The noise stopped. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer, but my heart was racing. I turned around to head back toward the cabin, but the forest had shifted. The landmarks I thought I remembered weren't where they should be, and the road I had driven on seemed further away than it should have been. I tried to stay calm and retraced my steps slowly, but the sound started again, this time closer, faster, almost like footsteps running behind me. Panic started to set in. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and slipping on wet leaves, my ankle twisting again. I barely noticed the pain, focused only on the desperate need to get back to the cabin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the roof peeking through the trees. I sprinted the last few 100 feet and threw open the door, slamming it behind me. My chest was burning, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I locked the door, even though I had no reason to expect anyone else to be there. I tried to convince myself I had imagined the sounds, that it was just the forest playing tricks. I spent the rest of the day inside, making sure every window was closed and double-checked the locks on the doors. That night, the storm hit. Rain poured down, hammering the roof, and the wind tore through the trees with a force I hadn't experienced before. I could hear the branches snapping and falling, some hitting the side of the cabin with a loud thud. Sleep was impossible. Around midnight, I heard it again, the shuffling. It was outside now, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was alone. I remembered the old hunting rifle tucked behind the fireplace. I grabbed it, checked that it was loaded, and held it tightly. I paced the cabin, listening as the sounds grew closer. Then, I saw something through the window, a dark figure moving just at the edge of the trees. My hands shook as I raised the rifle, but I couldn't get a clear shot. The figure didn't rush or attack. It simply circled, staying in the shadows, just far enough away to stay unidentifiable. Hours passed. I stayed awake, moving from window to window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first light, the figure was gone. The storm had stopped, leaving the forest dripping wet and the ground muddy. I ventured outside cautiously. The tracks were unmistakable. Someone had been circling the cabin, leaving deep boot prints in the mud. They were too large for an animal, too precise. I realized I couldn't stay there another night. I had to get out, but the forest had transformed again. Roads that had existed the day before were covered in fallen branches or disappeared entirely under the flood of rainwater. I followed what I hoped was the main path using my phone's GPS, but the signal was weak. I stumbled, slipped, and even fell into a shallow creek at one point. My ankle was throbbing now, but I pressed on, driven by fear more than sense. By late afternoon, I reached a small logging road. The mud had turned to thick sludge, but I managed to walk it until I found a passing truck. The driver was a local, and when I explained I had been lost in the forest, he shook his head. "That area's tricky," he said. "You don't want to be out there alone, especially this time of year." I didn't argue. I climbed into the cab, relieved, and let him drive me to the nearest town. I never went back to that cabin. The experience stayed with me for months. The fear, the isolation, and the creeping realization that people can be just as dangerous as the wilderness. Looking back, I understand now that I had underestimated how unforgiving the forest can be. The fear wasn't supernatural. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was real people, real danger, and the way the woods can hide it until it's too late. I learned to respect the wilderness after that. I learned to never underestimate a storm, never assume a forest is empty, and always make sure someone knows where I am. That weekend in Vermont changed me. I traded my need for solitude for caution, and while I still visit remote places, I never go alone, and I never ignore the signs that someone might be out there watching. The ending, in a way, was simple. I survived because I stayed calm, kept moving, and trusted my instincts. The cabin was abandoned, but the danger wasn't. That memory is clear in my mind every time I hear a branch snap in the woods or a footstep behind me in the dark. It's a reminder that fear isn't just in stories. It's in the real world, waiting quietly until we let our guard down. I had always loved visiting Grandma June's cabin, even though it was far out in the northern woods of Maine, miles away from any real town. The cabin sat on the edge of a small, overgrown clearing, surrounded by thick pine and birch trees. Its wood was gray and cracked from decades of harsh winters, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, as if the cabin itself were tired. I hadn't been back in years. The last time I had visited was during a summer break when I was 14. Now it was 2013, and I was 24. Grandma had passed away 2 years ago, leaving the cabin to me. I had put off coming here, thinking about what it might feel like to walk through a place so full of her memory. But work had been brutal, and I needed a break, so I decided to spend a week at the cabin alone. The drive up the winding dirt road took longer than I remembered. Pines leaned in close, their branches scratching against the old windshield, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and decaying leaves. I parked near the cabin, the tires sinking slightly into the mossy ground. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The porch sagged under my weight as I stepped onto it, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint mustiness of old wood. Sunlight filtered in through the grimy windows, illuminating floating motes of dust in the air. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked slowly through the cabin, touching the familiar surfaces. The furniture was all still there. The old armchair where Grandma used to sit with her knitting, the the small kitchen table with its uneven legs, the fireplace that always smelled faintly of charred wood. It all felt frozen in time, like stepping into a snapshot of my childhood. I opened the bedroom doors, checking the beds and closets. Everything seemed untouched for years. As the afternoon stretched on, I decided to explore the small cellar beneath the cabin. Grandma had always kept it locked, but the old padlock was rusted and broke easily when I pried it open. A narrow wooden ladder led down into darkness, and I could smell the damp, earthy scent of soil and old wood. Flashlight in hand, I climbed down carefully. The cellar was cramped and filled with shelves of jars, cans, and old tools. I was moving toward the back when something in the shadows made me freeze. First, I thought it was a pile of old blankets or rags, but as I shined my flashlight closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't cloth at all. It was a human body, lying face down in the corner, curled up as if trying to make itself small. The skin was pale and bluish, with patches darkened by decay. The smell hit me immediately, thick, sour, unmistakable. I stumbled backward, almost dropping the flashlight, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I had no idea who it was or how long it had been there. The body looked old, like it had been here for weeks, maybe months. The clothes were tattered and stiff, stuck to the skin in some places. There was no blood around it, no signs of a struggle. I forced myself to take a slow, steadying breath, trying to remember what I had learned in school about handling emergencies. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. The signal here was weak, but somehow it connected, and I explained as calmly as I could to the authorities where I was and what I had found. While waiting, I couldn't stop staring at the body, feeling a mix of horror and disbelief. Who could have ended up here in my grandmother's cabin? The thought of someone dying alone in a place I knew so well was unbearable. I tried to make sense of it. There were no obvious injuries, no blood. Maybe it was natural causes, I told myself. Maybe they had been hiding from someone or from the world. The mind can spin stories endlessly in these moments. Eventually, I went back upstairs, pacing the small living room and trying to focus on anything but what I had seen. The walls, the furniture, even the faint smell of old would seem to carry the weight of the discovery downstairs. I kept the flashlight on just in case and closed every window and door. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time, the isolation of this place felt suffocating. By the time the police arrived, it was nearly dark. I led them down into the cellar, and their faces went pale as they saw the body. They worked quickly and professionally, taking photographs, checking for any signs of foul play. I learned later that the person was a man in his early 50s. His name was David Mears, a drifter known to local authorities. He had been reported missing by his sister months ago. The cause of death was eventually determined to be natural, likely a heart attack. He had wandered into the woods during a storm and found the cabin, seeking shelter, but no one had come across him in time. After the police left and the body was taken away, I stayed in the cabin for a while longer, trying to come to terms with what had happened. It was surreal to think that someone had died in a place that felt so familiar and safe to me, that life and death could intersect in such an ordinary, terrifying way. I spent the night by the fireplace, the shadows flickering on the walls, and I felt a profound sense of respect for the fragility of life. The next morning, I went outside, walking slowly around the cabin. The sun shone weakly through the trees, and the air smelled fresh after an overnight rain. I noticed small details I hadn't before. The way moss grew in thick patches on the north side of the cabin, the faint tracks of small animals in the damp soil, the way the wind whispered through the branches. Life went on, indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred here, but I carried the memory with me. Before leaving, I cleaned the cabin carefully, opening the windows and airing it out. I wanted to reclaim it from the shadow of what had happened, to make it a place that could be remembered for something other than death. I lit the fireplace, made myself a cup of coffee, and watched the smoke curl up the chimney, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. The cabin still had its memories, both happy and haunting, but I realized that a place could hold sorrow and still be safe, still be home. I left the cabin that afternoon, the dirt road stretching out in front of me like a ribbon through the woods. I glanced back once at the gray, sagging structure and felt a quiet gratitude for the life it had sheltered, for the memories it had given me, and even, oddly, for the brief connection it had given me to someone I would never know but whose story had ended here. Driving away, I felt a strange sense of closure. The cabin remained, silent and steady, ready to keep its secrets and its stories. But I knew I could return without fear, carrying with me a deeper understanding of life, death, and the fragile moments in between.